because there's so much misinformation out there that we're all subjected to in books, on the internet, in the newspaper. There's tons and tons of information, and I almost feel like saying, ignore everything that you see on the internet because most of it is false. And it's obviously an overstatement, but there's a lot of really false information out there. And so I wanted to make a book and to provide a lecture that basically would sort of cut through a lot of this misinformation that's out there and say, well, what is really supported by science? We can get into this little nitty-gritty stuff about this and that, but I think for most people what you want is kind of an overview of what sound nutrition is, something that you can talk to your clients about because they're going to be coming in and they're going to ask you questions. So you want some fundamental stuff that's basically always going to be true because it's not based on some fad, it's not based on the latest, greatest. It's based on fundamental information about nutrition that has stood this test of time. And I'll give you an example of some misinformation out there. And this is probably one of the biggest pieces of misinformation. How many of you have heard this argument that we should all be on low-fat diets? I think it's pervasive. If you haven't heard it, you're not paying attention. It's pervasive in our culture, right? Everything is like new books that come out, when they're talking, interviewing people on the radio, when they're talking about newspaper articles, it's always low fat, low fat, low fat. If you're talking about, what's a healthy diet to put into our schools because all our kids are getting fat, what can we do? Oh, we need to put a low fat diet in there. This is sort of across the board believed by our society. So my question is what is that based on? And the answer is nothing. It is a fad diet that was started about 35 years ago, 40 years ago maybe, with no documented scientific information to back it up. And it has just been repeated and repeated and repeated so much that people just kind of accept it and think, oh, I want to lose weight, I want to feel better, I want to treat diabetes or whatever, I need to be on a low-fat diet. And this isn't just me saying that that's not a good idea. This is the premier nutritionist, people could argue this is the premier nutritionist for the United States. This is a Dr. Willard, who's at Harvard University. He's their head of their nutrition department, and he has lectured extensively about this. And his statement, which I have quoted in my book, but is something to the effect of that the low-fat diet was the biggest dietary fad, and it's done more to undermine our health than any other dietary thing that we've done. And that it has, and this is almost a direct quote, it has directly contributed to diabetes and obesity. So this is an example of this false information that gets relayed out there and passed around. And we're going to talk more about some more underlying information about why the low-fat diet is a bad idea. But that's just, like I say, one example of a lot of misinformation out there. So I go back to how can we figure out some fundamental things that you can use, that I can use, that people can use, that isn't false information. And to me, what you want to do to get this information is you want to look at two different things. You want to, number one, you want to look at how people ate historically, and we're going to be getting into that. And I don't mean historically in the sense of your parents, your grandparents. I'm talking about generations and generations ago, when we were living a more natural life, when our genetic information was being developed. What were people eating? Because we should be, I think, at least similar to that. And the other place we want to look in order to find good information is what kind of scientific studies that have been done that really, what kind of diets do they support? And now this gets into a little sticky information because you get into this thing of, well, gee, I just read a report that says, broccoli is bad for me, and white bread is good for me, and et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of really bad science going on out there. When I'm talking about good science, I'm talking about long-term, large-scale studies that have been done on population. And there's been a number of these done. There's a women's health study, there's a nurses studies, there's several big studies that have been done in Europe. And they all come up with very similar information about what kind of diets we need to be eating, which we're going to be talking about today. One example of this bad science, is, I love quoting this study. So there was a study done a few years ago. They came out, it was in the newspapers, it was on the radio, it was even published in Yoga Journal, about how colas were just as good for us as water, right? So this was making the rounds of the new science that has come out. And so I knew that this wasn't true, just instinctively, and by all my years of studying nutrition, but I decided, well, where did they come up with this? So I actually looked up the original study that was done. The original study, red flag number one, original study was a one-day study. Number two red flag, it was like, 6 people or maybe a dozen people. It wasn't very many people. So what was the study? Well, what they did was they took some people and they took their blood samples from them in the morning. And then one group drank water all day and another group drank cola all day. And I think there was a third group that maybe had tea or something different. I don't remember exactly. And then at the end of the day, they took their blood again and said, oh, has it changed? Is their glucose different? Is their sodium different? Is their potassium different? And lo and behold, there wasn't a statistically difference in these blood tests. So they said, oh, cola is just as good as water. Now, the other red flag of this was the little punchline at the end of the study, when you read the study, which is who sponsored the study. It's Coca-Cola Company sponsored the study. This is why it was such a bad study. And it was done in a university with a real researcher who did this, somebody that they basically hired to do this research. Really poor study, but it got a lot of publicity, didn't it? It was out everywhere because Coca-Cola has deep pockets for getting this information out there. And so you've really got to be watchful of all of this kind of stuff when you're looking at the new studies or new weight loss books or new health books or whatever that are coming that you're going to be exposed to. And you're going to apply some really simple information and some really simple questions to them.